our fifth panel of the conference, which is going to be moderated by Victoria Sampson, who you are already familiar with, here sitting to my right, will explore shining a light on space activities, clarity and transparency for peace and security. So having said that, I'm very pleased to hand over the floor to Victoria, who, in case you don't remember, she is the Chief Director of Space Security and Stability of the Secure World Foundation, and she will tell us a little bit more about the panel and the expert panelists that we have assembled for all of you here today. Victoria, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Almadina. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. Hello, those of you online. Again, my name is Victoria Sampson with the Secure World Foundation, and I'm delighted to have the after-lunch lull of program paneling of looking at shining a light on space activities, clarity and transparency for peace and security. So we have a great panel here, but I just want to give a little bit of introduction for why we're doing it, and maybe some resources that might be of interest to those of you who want to think further about this topic. In order to ensure and maintain space as a safe, secure, and peaceful environment, it is necessary to foster transparent space activities to reduce ambiguity and uncertainty around intentions behind space activities. The practical implementation of TCBMs in outer space has been proposed in several multilateral fora. Greater transparency could be achieved through the clarification of terminology and the sharing of policies, doctrine, and data in order to increase and enhance space security, with the goal of preventing an arms race in outer space. This panel will analyze the opportunities and limitations of existing tools and frameworks in generating transparency, consider areas where states could develop new transparency and confidence building measures, as well as new incentives to implement and report on existing TCBMs. And with that, before I introduce my excellent panel, I just wanted to highlight a couple of products, as I said before. Over to our right on the SWAG table, you see the Space Security Lexicon was a joint unity or secure world production. And I know it was mentioned in the previous panel, but I just want to go a little bit more into what it is and why we think it's relevant for TCBMs. So this Space Security Lexicon came out of us watching discussions happening in multilateral fora and recognizing that participants were coming to these discussions with entirely different, not just different perspectives, but different understandings. A lot of the terminology that's used in these discussions. And so what we wanted to do is not to fix that, because frankly that's not our role, but to help, you can't fix what you don't understand, and so to help identify the extent of the different understandings of these terms. And so it has three parts. The first part is acronyms, which I think are mostly understood, although we got flack on one of the acronyms, but generally speaking, they're mostly agreed to acronyms. And then we had a list of words that were commonly understood definitions, and again, mostly, although we did get some input on that. But by far the longest part looks at terms commonly used during space security discussions that require further consideration. And so when we worked on it, we put together this list, and then we had a group of subject matter experts, about a dozen of them, representing native speakers of all 6 UN languages, with the idea that they would look at it and talk about different perspectives. And again, not trying to solve it, but just trying to identify, okay, here's the different topics and issues. And so this is not meant to be like the end-all and be-all word on the matter, but saying, okay, these topics were discussed, here's a sort of terminology that we were thinking of, and identifying for future discussions. So it's not meant to be the final word, but maybe help to start off with common perspectives. As well, it's meant to be a living document, and so you can see online we have the idea of updating it when relevant, so not an annual review, but should certain terminologies come up that we feel should be in there, we'll be adding it. And of course, it's available in all 6 UN languages as well, both in person, here, hard copies, and online. So I wanted to just flag that for your viewpoint as well. Another product, the Space Security Portal. Again, a Unity and Secure World product with the idea that it's an interactive map of the world that demonstrates the space security governance. And so the idea is you can click on any country, almost any country in the map, and it'll pull up major treaties that they've signed relevant to space security. If they have government structures that focus on space security, talk about that, legislation. So it's not meant to be everything they do on space, because again, it's a space security portal. But again, it's helped to just identify what sort of policies, strategies, budget decisions they have. And again, that's very helpful from a transparency perspective, because it allows you to say, okay, well, if the country X does something, I can click on them and say, okay, do they have a strategy for this topic? Do they have strategic goals for this? And just trying to help understand the background, so you, again, a common understanding of these sort of things. And then finally, not here, but I talked about this yesterday, I'll talk about it on my deathbed, but the Secure World Global Counterspace Threat Assessment. One of the things, reasons why we wanted to put that together was the idea that we wanted to have a holistic view of activities that happen that are relevant to counterspace activities. So it's not just identifying the 5 different counterspace activities that we have in the discussion for the 12 countries, but we have sections looking at policies, budget, goals, the idea is, okay, do they have a military space organization? If they have so, what have they said in terms of doing it? What's their, do they have a published space strategy? Do they have published budget, stuff like that? With the idea of contextualizing discussions and contextualizing activities so you can understand these better. And again, I think each in themselves is not going to fix the situation, but taken together, they can help make it a stronger whole so that we can have good viewpoints and discussions on these issues. So with that, I'll stop the advertisements for our products and actually let you hear the panel you're here to discuss. It's going down the line in terms of the order they are in the agenda. We have Emmanuelle Maitre, who's the research fellow for Fondation pour la Recherche Stratégique. She's worked as a research fellow for them since July 2014, a graduate of the Institut d'études politiques de Paris, Sciences Po. She works on issues of nuclear nonproliferation, deterrence, and disarmament. Before joining FRS and after working consultant in the private sector, Emmanuelle worked as a research assistant at the Center for Arms Control Studies. Next, we have Emma Gatti, who is the editor-in-chief of SpaceWatch.global. Emma is a planetary scientist and geologist with a PhD from the University of Cambridge and 2 postdocs from NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory in Caltech. After returning to Milan, Dr. Gatti transitioned to the field of space economy and space policy as an analyst. In 2022, Dr. Gatti assumed the role of editor-in-chief, writer, and radio host for SpaceWatch Global, a leading platform dedicated to exploring the latest trends in the space sector. Next, we have Felipe Cousinho, who's the ambassador of Chile to the Denmark and the Chilean expert to the GG and further practical measures on Paros. He's been the ambassador of Chile to Denmark since July 2023. At the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, he has worked at the Policy Planning Division, the Cabinet of the Minister of Foreign Affairs, as Chief of Staff for the Director General for Foreign Policy, as Deputy Chief of Staff for the Vice Minister of Foreign Affairs, and as Director for National and Homeland Security. As well, Ambassador Felipe is currently a PhD candidate at Leiden University, so a little busy. And then finally, we have Madame Massi, who's the founder of the Maldives Space Research Organization, he's the president and founder. So MISRO is the first entity in the Maldives dedicated to the development and research of the space sector. MISRO was founded in 2022 with remarkable support from the international space community after Mana attended the International Space University Space Studies program. And so with that, I'm going to start, just ask questions and have everyone give their, actually we'll start and have your viewpoints on the topics at the hand. So we're going to start again with Emmanuelle. Thank you very much, Emmanuelle.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction, and thank you for your invitation. I'm really honored to be in this panel and this very important conference, especially because my field of expertise, as you just have heard, is not space per se, but rather arms control. But it's extremely useful and interesting for me, working in particular on my day-to-day basis on non-proliferation of WMDs and their delivery vehicle to be able to make the bridge with the space community. And of course, there is a clear connection between the issue of space security in itself and the non-proliferation, of course, especially the non-proliferation of ballistic missile. And this connection is gaining in importance. We see it with the development of many launcher programs around the world. And in this context, transparency is really a common feature that we find that is developed in the strategic domain, the missile proliferation domain, and also, of course, the space context, with the view in particular to clarify the peaceful nature of some of the activities that are conducted. So with that in mind, I would like to kick off the panel, maybe to throw 3 general remarks. The first one is that there are many dimensions to transparency regarding space activities, depending on what you consider. Of course, transparency can apply to what is being launched. It's something that has been discussed in the conference already, but it's important to look at the launcher itself and informing about the launch in itself, about the type of vehicle that is being used and developed is important for space security. But as I was implying, it's also important to prevent escalation on the ground regarding, in particular, the possible confusion between a space launch vehicle and a ballistic missile. This is what has led a number of initiatives in the strategic domain in bilateral arms control, but also a multilateral instrument that has been adopted in 2002 and which is dealing with both types of objects, so ballistic missiles on the one hand and space launch vehicles. And this is the Hague Code of Conduct. So for those who are not familiar with this instrument, it was adopted in 2002. It now has 145 subscribing states, and its goal is really to try to curb the proliferation of ballistic missiles. But to me, it's really interesting to see that to do that, it really considers ballistic missiles and space launch vehicles together in terms of the kind of confidence building measures you need to apply. And in particular, so there are general instructions regarding exports and restraint in exporting systems that may be diverted to military use. But it's also quite significant in creating an obligation for the subscribing state to notify any launches of the two types of systems, so missile test on the one hand, space launch on the other hand. And so the code has been able to create a multilateral system and an online platform where states can notify their launches, whether it is a missile test or an orbital launch. The second remark is that, of course, the interaction between the two domains is going in both ways. Regarding space security in the optic of preserving space as a common good, it's essential to know when the launches occur, what types of launchers are being used, and of course, what types of objects are going into orbit. But on the other hand, taking the missile proliferation angle, it's also important to understand which actors have these capacities, what they are launching, what they are using to launch objects into space, what are the industrial capacities and the production capacities to develop these types of objects. Of course, this is absolutely not a way to try to restrict access to space to anybody who try to restrict the number of stakeholders that can develop launchers, but it is about bringing light on the possible risks of transfers of technologies that could have, or components that could then be diverted towards a missile program. And of course, in addition, transparency may be useful to reassure countries, partners, industrial actors on the behavior of other stakeholders and limit the risk of worst case assessment. Lastly, I would say, and maybe this is a topic that we will re-explore during the panel, there are many developments today that are making transparency regarding launches and launches even more important. And that is especially due to the fact that there are much more states and non-state actors developing and launching rockets. But we see also new launch pads, for instance, around the globe, in new regions, even, of course, offshores. What we see also is that what were the traditional ways to distinguish between intercontinental ballistic missile program and a space launch vehicle, these types of difference are slowly fading away, with some features, for instance, the types of fuels being used, the production methods, the launching patterns. These types of elements tend to be to have more commonalities today than they used in the past. So in this context, it's all the more important to be transparent about launches and to ensure that the potential so observers, potential adversaries do not misinterpret a space launch with a missile attack, or do not have any, as I said, worst case assessment about the nature of a program, which is the main purpose of the types of CBMs that exist today in the strategic domain to try to cover both types of objects.
Thank you, Manuel. And next we'll go on to Emma. See if your opening remarks, please.
Does it work? Yes, perfectly. Hello, everyone. Thank you for inviting me. I want to personally thank Almudena and Victoria for inviting me here. This is my first time in Geneva. It's a fantastic city, definitely worth coming back. So I am a space journalist, space analyst, so I don't have the in-depth technical knowledge to comment on many of the questions that maybe will be posed today during this session. However, what I can offer is a sort of horizontal view of how words and information are used by our sector towards the external world and how these words can affect the factor of transparency and how can they affect the entire industry at large. So I want to start from a story that has been inspired by Emmanuel's comment about the need to understand why we are launching what we are launching. A few months ago, North Korea launched and failed to launch an unknown satellite, an unknown object. And we have tried for weeks to understand what was the official version of the launch. What is this satellite? Is a Earth observation satellite? Is something else? And it was fundamentally impossible to understand what was the nature of this object. It was, the press decided to call it a weapon or some sort of belligerent tool. It was fundamentally impossible to understand what it was. The complete lack of communication from the North Korean side allowed the complete spur of misinformation and speculation. We assumed maybe it was a weapon. We have no idea what it was. So what I'm trying to say is that the lack of transparency from any type of sector fuels a circle of misinformation, suspect, lack of understanding that doesn't help anyone in the industry. Because in the moment when the informations are not provided, the other side will fill the gap with what they know or what they think they know or what they want to know. So it's a sword on each other's head. Now, the example of North Korea should not be taken as the only exercise in lack of transparency. There are ways in which we, from Western countries, also struggle to communicate, struggle to maintain a clear, cutting-edge version of the problems. Let me give you a very practical example. In the session before us, Jessica posed a very interesting point about dual-use technology. Now, dual-use technology deserves to be tackled because it can be risky. Victoria before mentioned the problem of technological pollution. There are so many aspects of our industry that we don't like to discuss, that we shy away from, whether it's because they're uncomfortable questions, whether because we didn't decide to think about them. But the net result is that less we answer those difficult questions, less transparent we are where we need to be transparent, and more we fuel a future of doubts and lack of understanding. So in this, and what happens is that in this gap of knowledge, in this gap of transparency, then is filled with fake informations, mistrust, lack of mutual collaboration. So we need to be transparent, absolutely. And we need to be transparent, especially on those matters that are somehow uncomfortable to deal with. Final point, transparency is a very complex concept. My experience from interviewing several scholars in the geopolitical sectors is that there is the perception that different cultures perceive transparency in different ways. So one of the questions I often ask myself is these cultural components are taken into account when we're trying to deal diplomatically with the concept of transparency. And it's something that I don't know because press by definition is not allowed to enter the closed doors negotiations, but this is something that will be very interesting in understanding what the floor and what the audience think about that. Do we have collaborative, peaceful, constructive collaboration and discussions about the difficult issues that we're facing, taking into account cultural differences among us? Thank you.
Thank you, Emma. Next we have Felipe. Opening remarks, please.
Thank you, Victoria. First, I would like to thank UNIDIR for the opportunity to participate in this important conference, which takes place in a very critical moment, as we have just concluded the process of the group of governmental experts on further practical measures for the prevention of an arms race in outer space in Geneva with a successful outcome, which was, we're happy that we were able to provide, as we were able to adopt the report by consensus. I am particularly honored by the high level of the fellow panelists and the discussions we're having in all the other panels, and would like to share my perspective from the eyes of a diplomat that comes from a country of what is known as the Global South, and has actively participated in the discussions on space security and sustainability in the last decades. I'm particularly happy to share the panel with Victoria and Almudena, which we have done many interesting things before, including a very important event back in Santiago a couple of years ago. So it's always great to be back among friends. The topic of today's panel is particularly relevant as the main challenge has been and still is to overcome the existing mistrust between nations and reach a common understanding on the existing legal framework, the terminology, and on the legitimacy and extent of our outer space activities carried out by governments and private companies. Space, as we know, has become a key domain for the technological, economic, and strategic development of nations. It is no longer just a realm of science or exploration, but also a stage where vital interests are at play. From the satellites that support our communications and navigation systems that was mentioned in the panel before, to scientific research, all of these infrastructures are constantly under threat. Accidental collisions, space debris, and growing geopolitical tensions on Earth can all be transferred to outer space in some way or another. In the face of these challenges, transparency between states is more crucial than ever. Without a clear and sincere commitment to sharing information about space activities, the risk of misunderstandings and conflict rises. Transparency not only mitigates these risks, but also promotes international cooperation, a topic which also has been touched in this important conference, reinforcing key agreements like the Outer Space Treaty of 1967, which establishes the peaceful use of outer space. In this regard, outer space is also vital for countries like Chile, contributing in a broad range of issues, from management of natural disasters to its applications in the field of defense and border security. And it's particularly critical for communication in a country that's geographically long, thin, remote, and prone to natural disasters, as you may know. In this regard, outer space is also the Presidential Advisory Council on Space Matters, chaired by the Ministry of Science, Technology, and Knowledge and Innovation. It's a very long name for a very small ministry. It has the duty of creating a national space policy and a national program that preserves the interests of Chile. As I mentioned before, Chile has participated in all international discussions on space matters, including the last open-ended group on reducing space threats through norms, rules, and principles of responsible behaviors, which was brilliantly chaired by my colleague and friend Helmut Lagos, that many of you know, and the group of governmental experts on PAROS, in which I had the honor to participate, and that was examined in an excellent panel yesterday. One of our areas of special interest is astronomy. As you may know, Chile is one of the main hubs for astronomic observation, with one of the world's clearest skies and biggest and most advanced observatories, including the European Southern Observatory in the Atacama Desert. Astronomers, among other contributions, provide critical data on the location and behavior of objects in space. This information is not only essential for science, but also protects our infrastructures in orbit and helps prevent potential collisions. Astronomy, by offering objective and accessible data, creates an environment of greater transparency and security. This shows how multilateral cooperation becomes crucial. In a domain like space, which belongs to no particular nation, it is imperative that multilateral collaboration be the cornerstone of space governance and security. No country, no matter how powerful, can face the challenges of space alone. Only through a multilateral approach, where states, international organizations, private actors, the scientific community, and civil society work together, we're able to develop what is needed to ensure the peaceful and sustainable use of space. This was highlighted clearly in the previous panel. Multilateralism fosters inclusion and dialogue, where every nation, regardless of its size or technological capacity, can participate in decisions that affect the entire planet. It is a means to ensure that space does not become a battleground for destructive competition, but rather a shared space for the benefit of all humanity. Additionally, multilateral fora offer a neutral platform for resolving disputes, regulating new commercial activities, and managing space resources in a fair and equitable manner. Finally, I would like to reflect on a proposal that I presented as a working paper for our discussions at the GGE. So please allow me that self-reference. Considering all the above, and taking into account the challenges in finding common ground to advance in the context of the current geopolitical environment, I propose the possibility of negotiating one or more additional optional protocols to the Outer Space Treaty, the cornerstone of the international legal regime on space matters. The proposal is based on the age of the treaty, signed in 1967, and the urgent need for it to be able to encompass current and future developments in human activity, considering rapid technological advances and the growing presence of new space actors, as well as interaction between them. A protocol or protocols can contribute to developing and lending clarity to the principles enshrined in the OST. It can foster dialogue and contribute to strengthening cooperation and confidence among actors by developing set principles. The proposal is not to renegotiate the OST, but to develop optional additional protocols to allow those states interested in strengthening this instrument to do it by emphasizing some concepts that consider the experience of the last 5 decades. The proposal would allow to address the threat concerns in a gradual way to the event of the will and possibilities of each state, without necessarily contradicting any additional process, effort, or proposal of legally binding instruments or any other initiatives in this regard. The proposal is therefore complementary with other paths currently addressing issues such as the militarization of space and the application of international humanitarian law in outer space, to name a few. Also can contribute to fostering implementation of TCBMs, such as the one proposed in the consensus report of the 2013 GGE, and contribute to provide clarity and transparency, which we agree is fundamental for peace and security. I will leave it there for now. Thank you.
Thank you, Felipe. And last but not least, Man.
Thank you, Victoria. So I'll start the introduction by addressing the elephant in the room, which is why on earth is Maldives here in this forum talking about space security, let alone space. So the relevance of space to Maldives is obvious. We are a large EEZ with a very small territorial land. We are 1 million square kilometers in EEZ with just less than 90,000 square kilometers of land, which means we have a very large territory or sphere of influence to manage. And for a small country like ours, it is nearly impossible without the use of space assets. But it's not just the spatial dimension. We also need satellites on a regular basis to protect ourselves from disasters, and especially in the current context of the climate crisis, where we're finding that our traditional knowledge of weather and also the available information from regional weather models are not sufficient enough to protect our ecosystems, to protect our economy. In fact, just a couple of weeks ago when I was in the Maldives, we had almost 3 or 4 days of complete carnage with a storm that had the government to stop its offices, where the seaplane operators that take the tourists to the famous resorts and beautiful beaches were completely stranded because we just did not have the data. We know the data is available through space, and one of the reasons MSR, or the Maldives Space Research Organization, was founded and established was to address that gap. We need to learn how to use the existing space assets to cater for our very immediate needs. On top of that, we are a civil society organization, but we are working very closely with the government of Maldives. Last month, we had an MOU with the Ministry of Defense that was all-encompassing on all matters of space, but specifically highlighted the relevance of space security. We actually had Victoria and Al Medina, Secure World and UNIDIR attend the Space for Island Nations conference a couple of months ago in the Maldives. So we founded the Space for Island Nations conference precisely because the matters of island nations are not adequately discussed in forums like these. And their contribution was incredible. It was the first time that SIDS representatives contributed to this conversation around space security. And in fact, there's a great piece of work that was published by UNIDIR on space security for small island states. And I would recommend all of you to take a read. So that's just from the perspective of addressing the elephant in the room. In terms of the topic at hand, TCBMs, and really the general idea of how do we make sure that the matters of space security is addressed adequately outside of legally binding discussions, I think SIDS countries especially has a vital role to play in these conversations. Over the past day and today, I've learned a lot about this domain. And one of the things that I wanted to emphasize is island nations such as the Maldives we deal with a very similar problem because we deal with large maritime areas with dispersed islands. And in a way, it is analogous to the problem that we have with space security as well, although it is not exactly the same. And there are certain types of initiatives and international collaboration in maritime security that we think that might be useful in these conversations. One such example that Maldives is a part of is the Multinational Communications Interoperability Program, MCIP, where we do the Pacific endeavor. And the reason I bring this up is, from my understanding in these past 2 days, a lot of the discussions around space security, both in the OAWG and GGE, are very strategic. But for countries like the Maldives, the conversation has to become operational soon, because the moment we have a disaster or a space security issue in space, it is far too late to decide how do we react operationally. And so MCIP is, at least in the maritime security domain, a really good example of how countries, both state entities and non-state entities, can come together to understand what are the operational requirements, what are some of the scenarios that we can address that can really help. And there are so many achievements that MCIP has achieved in that maritime security domain in making sure that all countries involved can respond to disasters. So this is just one such example. On top of that, SIDS countries also need to be involved in these discussions, primarily similar to the point that Victoria in the last panel mentioned, that this is not just a state-centric issue, it is a human-centric issue. And being one of the most vulnerable nations to any disaster like this in space, our voices have to be heard. And it's not just for the sentimental value, it's because we can offer solutions. Maldives is not just trying to be a consumer of space, we can be a contributor of space. We are at 0 degrees latitude, pretty much between 0 to 4. And we are the flattest country in the world. Which in this case is a great thing because we have access to a large part of the space domain that we can observe through the Maldives. And so we are actively trying to pursue capabilities around space domain awareness, SSA specifically, in a way to contribute this. But we can't do this in a meaningful manner if we are not part of these conversations. Because by the time we try to catch up, we can't afford to have already lost the ability to reach to the same level. And so it's been very heartwarming to see the discussions that have happened in the past day and even today. And we're looking actively to contribute into these discussions. And lastly, just wanted to highlight one specific point that was raised up a couple of times on matters such as in Paris. In my opinion, in the opinion of, I would say, almost all SIDS, TCBMs are not just a supplementary by the way step. In the absence of something legally binding, we have to ensure that we adequately address the TCBMs because we cannot afford the absence of a legally binding treaty to be the reason why that there's a disaster or an issue in space. And so we have to take the matter of TCBMs very seriously, and we are more than happy to contribute to the discussion. So, thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to start off by having a few questions for the panel, but as always, we'll open it up for the audience in a little bit. So those of you in person, be thinking about if you have any questions. If you have a placard, put it up, raise your hand. We're at that point. Online, no? All right. Online, we're not taking any questions. You guys can just listen. Oh, we are? Okay.
We don't have any questions.
Okay. I was just going to say, online, we would love to have some questions for you. Almudena will... No pressure online, but we will. Almudena is keeping an eye on. Will let me know if there are any. So, but we'll start here in person. So, just kind of big picture, looking at TCBMs. What existing tools and this is for the panelists, whoever wants to take this can. What existing tools and mechanisms can be used to contribute to transparency and confidence building measures between space actors? What initiatives by states are currently being implemented, and then where has implementation been less than successful? And are there areas where new measures are urgently needed for Paris? Who would like to take that first? Manuel.
Thank you very much. So I will start with what I know most, which is the Hague Code of Conduct that I mentioned earlier. And I think the history of this TCBM is really interesting because it comes, as I said, from the strategic domain with a double heritage, I would say. The one coming from export control and non-proliferation. It was first imagined by the members of the MTCR, the Missile Technology Control Regime, to try to restrict access to ballistic missiles. It comes also from strategic arms control, bilateral arms control between the US and the Soviet Union, and then Russia, who first came through with some of these CBMs in the field of ballistic missiles. But then I think today it has, of course, an effect, and it's important for missile proliferation itself, but I think it's mostly implemented within the space domain, because there are just so many launches that are being notified almost on a daily basis. So it's quite interesting to see the shift of that instrument. Two elements maybe that can be mentioned. The first one is that the Hague Code of Conduct was not negotiated within the UN, but it has been supported many times by UN GA resolutions. The last one, I think, had more than 170 countries supporting it at the UN. So I think that the principle of transparency on these objects has been really highly supported. Other CBMs that are included in the code, I mentioned the notification of tests, but countries are also asked to provide each year an annual declaration on their space launcher policy and their ballistic missile policy. And something else that is quite interesting is that states are they have the possibility within the Hague Code of Conduct to invite observers on their space launch sites. This is a measure that has been implemented a couple of times by Norway, by Japan, by France 2 times, who invited observers in Kourou, and most lately by the Republic of Korea. There was a transparency visit of the Naru space launch site just in March of this year, so with international experts and diplomats visiting. And interestingly, this measure, the visit of space launch site, the notification, these are elements that we find in various reports that have been produced by the GGE, for instance, the 2013 report. So we can see that these types of CBMs, the principles, even if the code itself is not referred, the principle, I think, is widely agreed in the international community.
Well, thank you. Well, firstly, I will start with a very obvious thing. You know, the first mechanism or tool we should contribute to transparency is the addition and ratification of the United Nations treaties, applicable treaties, including the OST. I think we should start, you know, from the basics. The second point is for the promotion of trust is the involvement of the different actors. Considering what today, more than ever, we have an increase of in the presence of companies, large and small, that have managed to massify the construction and launch of satellites and space objects. And as an example, the Chilean company Lemus put into orbit a nanosatellite for the monitoring of biodiversity. It is the first private satellite in Chile, and today is in the process of entering the registry of space objects through the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Santiago, with the aim of safeguarding compliance with the United Nations Treaty for the Registration of Objects. Launch tracking, as well as the specification of the orbit in which it is located and the objective of the satellite or other object launching to orbit, allows for monitoring from Earth, including through observatories, to avoid unforeseen collisions, increasing transparency and enhancing trust between states. The above goes hand in hand with space situational awareness and the sharing of data between states for the coordination, collection, and exchange of data on space objects and debris, providing a commitment of all actors to join and coordinate their work. And finally, there are important instruments available, like UNIDIR's security portal, and I'm not mentioning this only because they invited me today, which focuses on security issues, and that many experts at the GE consider as a useful instrument to improve transparency of states and other organizations' policies to space security. So I think there's a number of tools available, but we need to use them. So thank you.
So I deal with communication transparency, and it's kind of difficult how to implement it because you cannot force anyone to be transparent if they don't want to. I echo what has been said. Obviously, transparency of visits, inviting observers, diplomatic work, what I said before, transparency of communication, having diplomatic work that takes into account cultural discrepancies, and at least trying to find common points on which we can build a constructive transparency, at least in certain pockets of our work. And then I would say a change in language of rhetoric. Rhetoric is everywhere, of course, is in politics and is in space. I perceive two rhetorics in general, the civilian rhetoric and the military rhetoric. The civilian is the one that shies away from the difficult questions. We like to keep repeating us that space is good, space is fantastic. We have this kind of pink painted dreams. It's fantastic, yes, indeed. It's a very useful infrastructure, absolutely. We want to maintain it as smooth and as is today, yes. Do we have problems? Yes, of course. Are we generating potentially even more problem because of what has been said today? You know, commercial space in general is growing faster than technology itself, almost. Definitely faster than regulations, and we know that. So this civilian rhetoric of pretending that we don't make mistakes, that we don't have problems, that we don't create potential issues, I find it to be superficial. On the other side, we have in the military rhetoric, which doesn't shy away from the difficult questions. They have their own answer, but it's peculiar rhetoric because it divides the world in enemies and friends, in black and white. The world is complex. Diplomacy knows that. There are different shades of truth sometimes. So it is necessary, in my opinion, to address transparency of communication, take into account these complexities, and try to find also a common language, not only for space technology, but also for dealing with space towards the external public, towards the community, finding a common language that can not put gasoline on fire, and equally doesn't simplify everything to a situation of, yes, space is perfect, no, we don't have any problems. So this is where I find it difficult, how we can collaborate towards a adult, responsible, common language that doesn't play too much on rhetoric and goes towards a goal of peaceful community collaboration where we can find at least few points of agreement.
Thank you. Mon, I want to like a follow-up with you on this one. I mean, one of the things you could argue for TCBMs is demonstrating best practices. And in terms of, you know, from a national perspective, a best practice is kind of following what international obligations are for space actors. How is the Maldives working to demonstrate, you know, good behavior and best practices? Are you guys getting ready to sign the Outer Space Treaty? Are you becoming members of UN COPUOS? What's your thinking on that? And like, how do you determine which one to go for first? Thank you.
So is this on? Okay.
It is now.
Yeah, that's a good question. So first of all, the Outer Space Treaty, we are definitely in conversation of signing it. We recognize that it is definitely an important step towards being recognized as a meaningful contributor to the space conversation. But one of the approaches we've taken from a good practices of good behavior is we're really leveraging the dynamic between government and civil society, where government struggles sometimes to achieve the pace needed. Civil society can step in and really complement that. And MSRO and the government's relation is really a good example of that. And we've been around for less than 1.5 years. And in that amount of time, we've achieved an incredible amount of objectives just into getting into space. And in the specific point of Outer Space Treaty, because we know it'll take a bit longer to get it signed, we're taking the proactive step of getting Maldives to be an observer in COPUOS next year. And so that's something we're looking forward to. And so there are ways in which both the government can leverage civil society and civil society can empower the government in trying to get those steps done. The other good behavior and good practice, I would say, is leverage what your country is good at in other domains. The Maldives is exemplary when it comes to the climate conversation. The SIDS grouping was founded in the Maldives. And since then, we've been one of the most vocal advocates. The UNFCCC is our main forum, and all the climate-related conversation and papers was in part directly contributed by the Maldives. And so understanding how did we manage to do that and bring in those lessons to the Outer Space Security Conference and conversation, I think that's probably one of the ways that countries in similar positions can apply. Yeah.
Thank you. Okay, I know we have some questions from the audience, at least in person. United Kingdom, you have the floor.
Thank you very much to the panelists for their presentation. My name's Clive. I'm head of space security in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs for the UK. I have a few questions and a couple of observations, if I may. Firstly, to Emmanuel, it was interesting really to hear you talk about the diminishing differences between intercontinental ballistic missiles and space launch vehicles. And so I wonder whether, do you think the HCOC needs to change in some way to reflect this change? And do you think states are being diligent in the application, in the implementation of HCOC, or could there be improvements there? Would be my question to you. I really appreciated Emma's comments too on with the very sort of stark example of North Korea. I suppose maybe we have slightly lower expectations, but we have of them, but higher expectations of ourselves in terms of transparency. And I think you were alluding to Western countries having a struggle to communicate transparency on this as well. And I wondered whether you had a specific example to share. If not, no problem. And I also appreciated your comment on avoidance of rhetoric. And I think, yeah, and the challenges of having conversations around adult conversations, I think you referred to around this. And I think the 2013 report on transparency and confidence building measures recommended that states kind of establish some kind of mechanism for conversations to take place between states so that they can talk to each other to resolve potentially difficult situations they find in space or to clarify misunderstandings. And so I think your comment just kind of reinforces for me the particular importance of that recommendation from their report. And it's a great pleasure to see Madin represented on the panel too, representing the Maldives. And I think one of the things we agreed in the recent GGE was that all states' interests should be taken into account when we're talking about space security issues. And you've illustrated beautifully why that's the case. And so that's very inspiring and positive to see you sort of engaging in this issue. And I hopefully will see you and the other SIDS countries represented in the open-ended working group on responsible space behaviors to kind of bring these points, these important points to the table. And I'm very happy to have a conversation with you separately about that as well. And indeed, it's not just about ensuring your interests are taken into account, but also it seems like you have potentially a very good contribution to make as well to improving space security, even in a practical sense, such as using your geographical characteristics, for example, to achieve better space domain awareness, which is of course very important for the whole issue of transparency. So that's really sort of a positive to hear. And yeah, so anyway, I really like the title of this panel, Shining a Light on Space Activities, as long as it's not a laser, in which case we'll need to discuss that in the open-ended working group. But thank you very much. Sorry for speaking for so long.
And actually, I'm going to use the power of the chair to ask you a question. You know, one of the things that's really frustrated me about the 2013 GGE is that it had fantastic recommendations, but a lot of them not get carried out, including the one that you just talked about, creating the database of notifications. And I'm wondering why that is. Was there not political leadership by certain countries that needed to do it? Was there not financial support? Was it just never really, you know, was there not enough momentum for it? Because it's one thing, you know, I think TCBMs are a good thing to agree to, but unless they're actually done, they're worthless. So I'm curious, like, what happened in that case and how can we avoid that in the future? Can you speak for the whole global order on that one, please?
I wouldn't have asked any questions if I knew I was going to be asked a question in return. Is this allowed? I mean, I don't really know the answer, to be honest. I mean, I suppose the report took place in 2013, and just around that time, I guess the geopolitical situation started to get worse and worse. And I suppose this drives us apart from each other, even though it also means we ought to talk more. And I guess the balance is more not talking than talking at the moment. And that's why we just need to try and make a bit of effort to sort of reverse that situation if we can. It's a very trite thing to say, but I don't have any more than that. Sorry.
No, and I appreciate your graciousness in answering my question. Emma, did you want to respond to that?
I have an answer. You asked me if I was thinking about some specific example. So when it comes to transparency in terms of launchers and satellites, definitely there is a discrepancy between the West and the East. North Korea is kind of a staggering example, complete lack of information. We literally were not able to understand what they were launching. The situation in the West is completely different. You know perfectly what is about, what is the type of satellite, what they're going to do, where it's going to be, how long it's going to last. So when it comes to this type of technical transparency in space, definitely I can see the difference. When it comes to rhetoric and try to either spinning a narrative or not tackling certain complex geopolitical or other type of question. Yes, when I formulated this speech, I was having a case study that happened a few months ago. We were interviewing some very high level representative for the Artemis program. And we were interested in understanding the clear, in our opinion, polarization between the Artemis program and the ILRS. We were noticing that geopolitically, the nations going towards ILRS were not signing the Artemis program. And we were wondering if this was a flag of a interesting, important to study division of the geopolitics on Earth. And they completely denied it. It was like, no, of course not. Everyone can join Artemis, and if you join the LRS, you can also join us because Artemis is here for the good of humanity, etc. And of course, I do not doubt that Artemis has the fantastic purpose that we sign up Artemis. Absolutely, there is no doubt about the concept itself. But I was a bit surprised that something that, in my opinion, was so clear geopolitically was not even addressed in a context of an honest, professional, on-topic interview between experts. So that was when I started to reflect on the danger of adhering and following the rhetoric without looking at actually what is going on Earth and refusing to discuss it.
We have a question from online. Yeah, Royal Cardellini talks about geopolitical tensions affecting space cooperation. And he'd like to know, how much do you believe that kind of geopolitical tension will impact the pursuit of transparency in the domain, also considering its essential role for national security and defense? And what can be done to prevent this evolution to affect current efforts? So kind of building upon what our delegate from the United Kingdom said, but how can you counter geopolitical tension when trying to figure, I guess, common agreements for TCBMs? Thanks. Oh, hold on. We have a Emmanuel, and then Emma, and then Mon.
Thank you very much. I will also maybe bring a few elements on your question about the code of conduct. So I think the commonalities between the two objects, it's very clear now when we see, for instance, small launches being launched from a mobile truck, which really visually looks very much like a missile, but it's really at the core of why the code is considering both instruments. So basically, when in 1995 there was a Norwegian sounding rocket which was being confused as a missile by the Russian Federation, and it led to a few moments or a few minutes of uncertainty in Moscow. That's really the kind of situation which is addressed by the code and why it is focusing on the two instruments. So I think on that, and the fact that we have more and more small launchers and that they do look indeed like missiles, the code is quite well adapted to deal with that. And I think really states have complied to its requirements in terms of pre-notification and annual declaration in a way that indeed is quite actually resilient to geopolitical context. Today, states do notify, as far as we are aware, their launches, even missile tests. So that's quite interesting to see that there is realization on every side from the states, of course, that have subscribed to the code, but even some that have not subscribed to the code are linked by bilateral notification agreements. So we have the information that they see that it's really important for their own security to actually notify and to avoid other countries to misunderstand what is being launched. So that's quite interesting. And maybe to go a bit beyond, I think, on the technological changes, I think there are other elements that might lead to thinking about the scopes of these TCBM. And it's, for instance, some technological developments like the development of hypersonic gliders or other delivery vehicles in the missile sites, which are not included in these types of agreements. Even some development on the space side, the fact that some launchers may not actually be launchers, but that we might use other types of vehicles to deliver objects into orbit. This is not technically in the scope of these notification agreements. And I think, of course, the geopolitical context means that it's difficult to envisage a change of the scope in the near future. But however, I think there is really room for states to be quite liberal in their notification practices and to include objects that are not technically defined in the agreements. And it's kind of a best practice that can be done really unilaterally to keep with the spirit of the notification mechanisms.
Yeah, thank you. I think, geopolitical context, it is a challenge, but it cannot be an excuse. And, we in the past, we haven't been able to reach in important issues in disarmament, for example, in the nuclear realm, even during the Cold War, we had ways to deal with very complex contexts. And I would like to say about that, that diplomacy, and I say that as a very old diplomat, diplomacy needs patience. This is not, there's not always a straight line forward. You can go 2 steps forward and then 1 step backwards. We have seen that now. We had, for many years, we hadn't reached a consensus in Paris, in all the different processes. Now we did, and maybe next time we won't. Hopefully, yes. But we need to be patient, and we need to keep focused on the important things. In this case in particular, we mentioned the GGE. Of 2013, there were some things that were recommended, that we could definitely follow. Information exchange on national space policy and goals, and exchange of information on military expenditures. Some of those have been done. Not all over the world, as you mentioned. In some places better than others, but it's something that we can improve. Information exchange and activities in outer space, including orbital parameters, possible conjunctions, natural space hazards, and planned launches. Notifications on risk reductions, such as scheduled maneuvers, uncontrolled high-risk re-entries, emergency situations, voluntary visits to launch sites, and command and control centers, and demonstrations of space and rocket technologies. There's something, can be done as well. And especially international cooperation, consultative mechanisms, and other outreach activities that are also recommended as appropriate TCBMs for space. I know that we've been going around in circles many times and with little progress to show, and sometimes that's frustrating. But as I say, I think if we keep focus on the main things and the important things, even in challenging contexts, we can get somewhere. Thank you.
Yeah, I think the issue starts when we don't have the same parameters to value something important. That's where, if there is a disagreement on what is important, then it gets a bit challenging. I would say, maybe I elaborate on this, saying that I find important that we try to find pockets of agreement. We might not be friends, but we can still collaborate. There might still be areas when we can agree because we both want the same thing, is what we were saying in the session before. We all want to maintain space as a fluid, free, smooth infrastructure. And this is a common interest. So can we work together towards that common goal? So this is something that the commercial sectors does all the time. They find common interests and they work together on that little pocket. So maybe we can try to do something like that, taking into account what has been said, which is the fact that geopolitical tensions do exist and we cannot ignore.
Yeah, I mean, pretty much agree with a lot of the things that were said here. I just wanted to quickly mention in this topic, right? So geopolitical context is something that we are very aware of, because Maldives is situated quite strategically, both for a couple of great powers in the region. We have India, we have China, even Japan considered us as strategically important. And then we're also part of the Indo-Pacific security corridor as well. So, which means that even as an organization like ourselves, as we engage in our activities, as we try to build the space sector, we have to be hyper aware of all of these geopolitical considerations. I would say it's not impossible to balance them. We are in communication and in good terms with both ISRO and CNSA, for example. But it really, I think, as was mentioned here, it really depends on finding those pockets of agreement. And I'm quite hopeful after coming here, especially here in the GGE reached consensus in the latest version, and that is, I would say, an indication that it can be done. It might be hard, but it is crucial. One area that I would say that's probably really helpful in our context is, in theory, geopolitical challenges are very black and white, but in practice, is very context dependent. So, for example, when it comes to matters of SIDS or climate, you might have a consensus on a variety of matters, but there might be some specific exceptions. And it's really trying to identify what are some of the areas or even possibly countries that have certain relations with these different key power brokers, if I may, that we can really leverage in order to achieve that understanding. And ultimately, even if it's not achieved formally through any kind of legally binding treaty, what really matters is that on the ground reality is that it does not cause any kind of disruption. And that's really, from a country like ours, what's really important. Yeah.
Thank you. We had a question from the audience. If you can give your name and identify yourself, please.
Is this on now? Can you hear me? Perfect. Andrei Buklitsky, Unidir. Thanks to all the speakers for this very rich and very diverse panel. Let me play devil's advocate here for a moment. Everybody on the panel spoke very eloquently about how it would be good to have more transparency in TCBMs. And part of why we don't have it as much as we might have wanted is because maybe countries don't do enough, or maybe they don't prioritize it enough. But clearly, there is a part of it that in some instances, countries don't want to be transparent on some of the issues related to security. And on DPRK tests that Emma mentioned, maybe it's not the feature, that's a feature, not a bug, right? Maybe you don't want others to know, maybe you want others to overstate your capabilities, for example. So if the speakers could address this part of the debate, those instances, and what could be done here, and Emma started talking about it, but maybe expand more about it. Thank you.
Yeah, I know the question was towards Emma. I'll hijack it so that she has some time to think. I kind of wanted to give you, perhaps from our experience, a possible working model. In a lot of ways, I do agree with what you said, and I'm glad that you brought it up, because the reality is that countries might have, for various reasons, justified or unjustified, why they might not want to be transparent. I think there's a lot of inspiration to be taken from how we manage maritime security with, for example, voluntary identification using AIS. It's not mandatory, but the beauty of AIS is when someone turns it off, we can then focus on that. And so that means the overall number of objects we have to track at any given time is reduced by a significant margin. And that might be a very practical step to take. Like, can we come up with an AIS equivalent for satellites? I know Victoria mentioned about reflectors, which are a little bit more passive, but if we can agree on a voluntary system, then we can largely ignore those that are voluntarily identifying themselves and focus on those that do turn dark, similar to dark ships. But just my 2 cents on that.
No, it's a totally valid point. Some countries don't want to be transparent, and that's where the communication problem starts, because there is a part of the world that needs transparency. Actually, the entire sector needs transparency, because otherwise we create a lot of issues, and others don't feel comfortable or don't want to be transparent. My point was like, how do we deal with this? And which type of significance we want to attach to this? Why you don't want to be transparent? And can we find some agreement that certain things must be transparent? Are you not transparent because you're having something to hide? Are you not transparent because you perceive this as a declaration of weakness? Are you not transparent because it doesn't occur to you that transparency is important? I don't know. I totally accept the point. Certain countries might not want to be transparent. My only feeling is that before starting with the rhetoric of they don't want to be transparent, therefore they are enemies, we should try to think about why you don't want to be transparent and can we find some room of agreement, assuming that the situation is complex. When I say some rooms of agreements, it means that I assuming the complete agreement sometimes, especially when there is a geopolitical situation that, you know, if there is a power struggle, etc., full transparency might not be possible at the moment. So I'm just speaking about a diplomatic way in which we can all still try to make a pass and move forward in a peaceful and constructive way in situation where maybe complete alliance is not possible.
Three very quick points. The first one is that, of course, I think most CBMs, if they want to be functional, they have to respect to some extent security issue, national security issues. So there will be limitations on what you will ask states to display. However, my second point is that it can also work a little bit in reverse. And of course, from the strategic sector and arms control, that's also something we have observed, is that sometimes it is in the national security interest of a state to actually be transparent about some capacities and to display to the world that it does have some capacities. So it can also be used a little bit, maybe that's not the primary intent, but especially in the strategic sector, being open about what you have can also be considered as something that is going to serve security interest. And I think this is an argument that is even more easy to make. That's the third element. Today, it's quite difficult to hide some capacities anyway. So if you have open source intelligence and access by organizations, non-state actors, and so on, it becomes a little bit irrelevant to try to hide some capacities. Not some details, of course, are going to stay hidden, but hiding a whole space launch program or something like this sounds a bit ambitious in a time where we get so much information from non-state actors anyway. So it makes sense, in my view, to actually have your own narrative and bring the information yourself than to have the information about your programs being written in some think tank reports that you don't have really control over what is written. And I think it's quite complementary to have the official track. And then, of course, independent experts that can try to check or try to have their own views about what you have. But I think it really goes hand in hand. So hopefully it can convince states to overcome this very natural barrier.
Yes, thank you. I don't want to repeat what has been said. I totally agree with what has been said. I just want to say that, for example, in a recent work at the GGE, we had a lot of caveats, you know, that all the recommendations and things that we're saying were not without prejudice of national interest and national security concerns. And I think you have to take that into account if you're going to be realistic. But on the other hand, as it was said before, you know, there's a reverse argument that, you know, is in the national interest and in the national security concern that we have some transparency and we can share some information. And especially, you know, in the arms space, which technological advancement is going so fast, you know, and we're getting so many actors and so many space objects and so many things going around that if we don't do it, you know, at one point it will come back to our faces. And so I think there is an argument, you know, for this, even from the national security and national interest perspective. And that's why, you know, one of the processes that's been going around is been focusing on behaviors, you know, responsible behaviors. And I think that's also very important. You know, many important, very, very powerful countries, you know, have done unilateral declarations of things they're not going to do, you know, or things that they think that will contribute, you know, to a safer environment in space. And I think that's very good, you know, and every effort that we do, even legally binding, non-legally binding, soft law, responsible behavior, goes into that way, into that direction. The OEWG on responsible to reducing space threats through norms, rules, and principles of responsible behaviors did not reach a consensus report. There's a good chair report by Helmut Lagos, but they did reach some important progress in most areas of discussion, particularly identifying the main concerns of the international community on space threats. And I think having the diagnosis clear, it's a very important basis for what's coming next. Thank you.
Thank you. I believe we had a question from the United States.
Hey, Jessica Talk with the US. Just a thought from your earlier question, Victoria, with regard to implementation. I thought maybe I'd help Clive. I don't know, Clive, you can tell me if this helps or not. But building upon Felipe's comments, one of the things about TCBMs is that we shouldn't forget that the UN process generated these papers, right? You don't just publish something to be forgotten. So I think, everybody goes, oh, the 2013 TCBMs were just published and then everybody didn't implement them. It's actually really important that I think we recognize that they are continually reaffirmed, right? So for example, like these were published in 2013, but then in 2023, last year, there was a report of the Disarmament Commission for 2023, and they came out and said that we should promote the practical implementation of these TCBMs. Some of these ideas were repeated in the chair's report from the open-ended working group that the UK sponsored on responsible behaviors and reducing space threats, and then repeated for consideration in the Paris GGE report from August. So these things are not forgotten. I think the question is just how do we remember them and keep them in mind as we continue going through. Two more things, but I want to put in a plug for the UNIDIR space security portal. So one of the, as Felipe indicated earlier, one of the things is to share policies of doctrines, right? And the space security portal, thank you, UNIDIR, they have put together a voluntary mechanism where you can go ahead and put in your space policies and strategies. The US actually has quite a lot of information on this portal. It is literally spacesecurityportal.org. So we think that that is, other than searching through everybody's websites for their own information, like maybe that's a place that people could go to input their information. And then finally, I just want to note that, look, it's not, the TCBM 2013 TCBMs are really important, but it's not all just the TCBMs from that particular report. In the report itself, the TCBM folks noted that UN COPUOS was working on the long-term sustainability guidelines. And they said at the time, the guidelines would have characteristics similar to those transparency and confidence building measures, which while others could provide the technical basis for the implementation of certain transparency and confidence building measures. And it's really important to understand that right now, after the COPUOS adopted the 2019 LTS guidelines, that they're currently working on what constitutes the implementation, and will probably be coming out with a report on those in 2026. So across the board from the space side, I think the argument here was let's keep looking holistically. That's what I heard from our panelists, and absolutely, I think that is occurring. Maybe not as fast as we would like to, but certainly, we would hope that others would join in those TCBMs. Thanks.
Thank you, Jessica. And I guess building on the point that you made, how do we get to that point to where these are being implemented? Are there certain things that could be done to help encourage national implementation of these transparency and confidence building measures that have been already done? Is it a matter of capacity building? Is it a matter of making sure countries are aware of space security and its relevance to their interests? What can we do to encourage this? Any thoughts from the panel?
Yeah, I think, first of all, the work that UNIDIR and Secure World are doing is already a great kind of launchpad for countries like ourselves to quickly understand the nuances of space security. But I do think that it's important to have dedicated efforts at certain groups such as SIDS, primarily because our challenges are very similar. and contextualizing it to what are the specific issues that SIDS would face? Because as Maldives, we are very cognizant of the dangers of space security if we are not a part of it, but not every other country in the same grouping might be aware of that. And so it's important, and we are taking steps towards that through our own various forums, but it's important that we have these really localized and contextualized discussions, because there are so many terminologies and legal jargon that might get lost, and the key message may not be delivered. And it's important that we really try to boil it down to why should we care and how do we contribute meaningfully. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, well, I think there are several set of countries, and the same recipe really is not going to work for all of them. As Andre said, I think some countries are reluctant because they feel that there are national security issues. So here it's really a job of trying to convince that it can be done hand in hand with national security. I think for a number of countries, and once again, looking at what I know most, which is the implementation of these CBMs on launches, there is a fear that anything dealing with space and arms control may lead to restrictions on the acquisition of some technologies. And it's something that is, especially by developing nations and newcomers in the field, there is this idea that, yeah, it's CBMs, but behind that, there is probably a way to prevent us from getting access to technologies and to starting to launch our own systems if we want to. So here, it's also a work to try to really explain to what extent this might not be the case. Lastly, I think for some of these instruments, especially those that are multilateral or that are being negotiated in a multilateral framework, there is a question of involving states that may not feel they are concerned because they are not launching anything, they do not plan to launch anything, they do not have any industrial capacities to build components and so on. And so I think it's quite important to really show that actually every state is concerned, because every state has a stake in peaceful space, as was shown before. And because the additional pressure of a new state committing to this CBM is actually a step in the right direction to increase the global pressure for the states that do have these capacities to implement those CBMs. So I think really involving as many stakeholders as possible, even states that really are quite far from the object in question, is extremely important. And here, that's also great to have this kind of forums to be able to reach out to everybody.
Other thoughts from the panel?
Sorry, as I was listening to your speech, something that popped to my head was in this conversation, we rarely ever talk about the ground segment, which I think, especially for countries like ours, it's important. And ground segment is part and parcel of the space security conversation. So perhaps, that could be an entry point for a lot of these conversations, because without, especially if, countries like Maldives, we are actively pursuing ground stations in the Maldives. If we don't take into account the cybersecurity standards that we must follow and anything else that we have to follow that we may not be aware of, that does become a risk for everybody else. And so I think that's probably one area. And one thing that I do think might help countries that are reluctant or perhaps still on the fence is to understand that today the conversation around space security is very state-oriented, very state-centric. But in the future, similar to other domains, it will start to become more rogue. There'll be rogue actors, both private and state. And in that scenario, a lot of these conversations will fall apart, because you have irrational actors now in space, which in my opinion is inevitable, just given the trajectory we are at. And that's really where I would say, just alluding to one of the first things I mentioned, like having operational exercises, joint, multinational, multi-party, multi-stakeholder is really crucial, because then we get to really explore, like in a scenario like that, how do we actually react together? And in the process of those joint exercises, we might start to come to certain agreements that we previously did not, because in the abstract, it seemed really impossible to agree, but on practice, maybe it wasn't too bad. So those are some of the things.
We're getting down to the last 5 minutes, and I see China has their hand raised. If you could quickly do your question, and then we'll go to our final remarks. Thank you very much.
Thank you for giving me the floor. I think TCBMs are very important. I can hear the voice in the room. That's why China and Russia co-sponsored a resolution on TCBM to the first committee. My question, I want to be very brief. My question is about about TCBM. I think everybody knows there's a consensus recommendation report adopted last year in the UN DC, and TCBM should be on a voluntary basis and should take into the consideration of security of member states. And also, I want to bring to everyone. To your attention that there's not just only transparent but also confidence building. So measures not just transparent. I think it should help build confidence. If it's measure is transparent, but you may be deemed as a deterrence by others that could not help build confidence. So my question is how to balance those, the dimension, transparency and the confidence building. Thank you.
I'll just take one for the panel. I think at least from our context, the confidence building requires multiple levels of engagement from different stakeholders. Typically transparency is expected of the state because the state is responsible for any activities related to space in this context, right? But I think confidence building can be achieved if we engage more non-state actors, especially like civil society and private actors in these conversations where if, for example, we've achieved a certain agreement and especially when it comes to data sharing, for example, if it is obvious to the non-state actors within the society that, for example, the state is taking certain stances on these, those non-state actors could apply upward pressure that might incentivize the state to reconsider their position. So I guess confidence building could also be bottom up is, I guess, my point, and that might help. But obviously, states may not like to hear that. But just from a holistic sense, I do think non-state actors can play a vital role in each country. And it might even be cross-country. It doesn't have to be just the non-state actors within a country applying upward pressure. It could be cross-pollination as well. And I think that's definitely very crucial in this. There are a lot of alliances, for example, when it comes to maritime issues, sustainable fisheries, for example, that is a really good model for these matters. One good example would be the Maldives is known to be the most sustainable fishing country in the world. We use pole and line. Recently, there were considerations on using long line fishing, but across the world, there was a lot of pressure on the government and the actors reconsidering that because of its impact on conservation and marine life, and so the state had considered that. So I think the role of non-state actors probably is going to be crucial in this. Yeah.
Emma?
I think this is a very interesting question because somehow transparency comes with confidence and confidence comes with transparency. I would say that start to work together and share common ground and share some data sharing is important, but at least taking small steps towards collaboration and small steps towards transparency and then see how the pattern goes. It seems to me the most safe way to start a fruitful collaboration that can bring transparency and can bring confidence. I understand that countries that don't know each other or they still have some security issues, they don't want to disclose everything immediately, but if we don't start from somewhere, then we never progress. So working together as humans, it seems to me the first fundamental step to build both transparency and confidence, taking into account that both must exist together.
Thank you. Well, I agree with everything that has been said before. I would add one word: diplomacy. And I think in a broader sense, and because the difference between only transparency and confidence building measures is that the confidence building needs to be more proactive. You know, it comes with dialogue, with getting to know each other, as it was mentioned, to sharing information, to being active in sharing what's needed, you know, to build that confidence. So it's like a next step, you know, and I think we can work in different layers, and we are doing that. And there are different approaches to this, and I think, you know, and many countries have their own way, but if we have this conversation and we have this dialogue and we engage diplomatically, I'm pretty sure we can reach points of agreement.
Thank you. I think it's important indeed to recognize that transparency is not an end in itself. It serves a purpose, confidence building. If you invite observers on your space launch site, there are some buildings or facilities where you are not going to let them in because it doesn't serve any purpose and it might actually endanger the security of the facility. However, I think there is always in confidence building some notion of at least information sharing. And for instance, there is a notification agreement between India and Pakistan. There is a notification agreement on launches between China and Russia. We don't have access to the data that is shared between the two countries, but there is information shared. And I think this is providing the confidence. So transparency can be done at different levels. And it involves a range of, I would say, different steps, but indeed, it serves a purpose, and it was interesting to recall it.
Great. Well, thank you. Well, that takes us right at, just 2 minutes past, but right into our coffee break. Please join me in thanking this panel for an extremely lively and thought-provoking discussion.